Book 88 of 2019 was The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. So the reason I bought this book was because I had come across Douglas Murray's other book, which is called The Madness of Crowds, which was really, really good. I've done a review on that because obviously I read it previously. And that was good because it countered dominant leftist ideology that's currently within society. And Murray almost kind of like says in that this leftist ideology is almost fascist because it shuts down any kind of opposition, any kind of debate to their viewpoints. It's like if you disagree with an opinion, you're deemed to be bigoted and, you know, xenophobic and all the rest of it. So there's no debate there. So ultimately it becomes fascist. So I was interested in this one because this one's about immigration. And whilst the other one was kind of presenting arguments that allow you to kind of look at both sides of the debate and come to an opinion, I felt like this one, The Strange Death of Europe, was more right-wing and was more dominant towards right-wing. It was less of a, here's the alternative and here's the accepted view and make your own mind up. This one was more of a kind of look at everything that you've been ignoring. So it's a little bit more kind of biased, I felt, than the Madness of Crowds one. But what Murray is suggesting is, in this book, that there are actually negative impacts to immigration, and that a lot of people that have views against immigration kind of, they get almost, what's the word, like discredited and kind of, you know, people are like, oh, they're just like xenophobic or whatever. But actually, the viewpoints are warranted some of the time. And so Murray kind of discusses all the reasons why. So he's kind of almost like dismantling those leftist ideals which suggest that immigration is a good thing. I'm going to be looking at my board for a lot of this because there's so much that this book covers that, you know, I just want to make sure that I'm doing it extensively enough because I can't remember it all anyway. Murray's suggesting that what we've got currently is a European suicide. We are losing our culture. And the reason he suggests that that's happening is because we have this kind of guilt for what happened in the past and for what our ancestors did. And we kind of carry that around with us. You know, we have a lot of guilt because of colonialism. And the question is, why is that? Because, you know, Murray suggests that other countries don't appear to feel the guilt that Europe feels for its past. You know, our British Empire, for example, was not the only empire. You know, in the past there's been the Roman Empire, there's been the Ottoman Empire. You know, do places like Turkey feel as guilty for their past as what Europeans do? And Murray kind of suggests that actually they don't. You know, Britain particularly seems to be one of the countries where we're almost made to feel like we should be guilty for the past. And you see this a lot when kind of race gets discussed. And, you know, the question is as well, how far back do we have to feel guilty for? Like, from the dawn of time, or do we just go back to colonialism, or should we be going back further than that? You know, in our past as human beings, we've always been quite, you know, brutal and barbaric. You know, that's kind of our heritage. So should we be feeling guilty for our ancestors? And how many ancestors should we go back? Should it be one generation or two or three? Like, when does that even stop? It's kind of something that you can't even measure, so you can't even kind of, you know, equate that to anything. It just doesn't make any sense really as to why you would feel guilty for your ancestors. So, you know, whenever anybody kind of talks about like race and then they equate it to slaves, I always roll my eyes because I'm always just like, I can't be guilty for what my ancestors did. It wasn't me that did it. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that argument. It's like, it's just a bit ridiculous. So sorry, there was a lot of my board that I covered in just that kind of conversation there. So I'm like halfway through now. Essentially, immigration happened in Britain because of post-war shortages. You know, in labour, a lot of people had died during the war. And so they had to kind of allow people to come into the country to fill in those kind of, you know, work shortages. Otherwise we wouldn't have survived as a society. And so the government kind of changed policy to allow and promote immigration. In fact, I would argue actually that it happened kind of before that, because we had people coming into the country for war purposes as well. So a lot of our Commonwealth fought for Britain in the war, so they would have come in for that also. But what Murray suggested is that that was quite short-sighted of the government, because they didn't really think about when these people actually became, living in the country, and after the war and things like that as well. There was no kind of consideration of integration. There was no kind of consideration of how those people would assimilate into British culture. And so it's kind of like, you can't expect people to come into the country without any help to integrate. They're obviously just going to be the same culture that they were from wherever they came from. So you're going to have distinct cultures within Britain, and there's going to be a kind of competition between British culture and their kind of original culture. There is a question within kind of, people who aren't British, of whether there is a British culture or not. And yet, if somebody who wasn't British was to argue that someone didn't have a culture, we'd be deemed like xenophobic for that. So it's kind of like, why is it okay for other people to say that Britain doesn't have a culture? Because it does have a culture. And I think that a lot of people in Britain don't know that it has a culture, or don't realise that it has a culture, because I think a lot of people, unfortunately, are not very intelligent and don't have a lot of knowledge of history, and don't understand what other countries are like, because they're very blinkered and they see things from their own kind of perspective. Because our culture in Britain is that we are a tolerant place. We are respectful of other people. We kind of tolerate other people's viewpoints, and we discuss those. We don't kind of dictate how people should think and how people should act. We have a rule of law that we all are, we have to act within that. But that law is to protect people, and to, obviously it's not completely foolproof, but that rule of law helps, to our society to function. We have a democracy where we all have the right to vote once we get to a certain age. And that's not, kind of, it's a kind of fair democracy, in the sense of it's not like corrupt like other countries are. We don't have a dictator or anything like that. We believe in human rights. We believe that everybody should be treated well. And we believe in free speech. We believe that in our culture that anybody can say what they like, as long as it's tolerant and respectful and goes with the other kind of values. Unfortunately, other countries are not like that. Other cultures are not like that. And I think it's quite naive for people to not kind of recognise that. There was an initiative from the British government of Great British Values. And if you're within education, you'll be familiar with this. It was a real push to get people to understand what these values were, and to kind of help people from immigrant families to integrate better by understanding those values, because they do conflict with some cultures. And it was interesting, actually, because when these kind of got pushed in my old college, quite a few members of staff were like kind of rolling their eyes about it, and were kind of like, these are obvious things, these aren't British values, blah blah blah. But actually that was quite an ethnocentric view, because outside of Europe, things like tolerance and respect for other views and free speech and human rights and things like that are not a given. They're not a given. Like, you don't get those things for free. It's kind of, you've got to understand that actually you're living in quite a nice place in Britain that has all those things that, some other countries don't have them. And so, Murray kind of gives lots of examples of immigrants that don't have the same cultural values of people from Britain. So, for example, he uses an example of, in fact, no, I'm going to come to that in a minute, because the next thing that I was going to say about was that Murray suggests that Angela Merkel, who is, I was going to say, a Prime Minister of Germany. Is that the right terminology? The leader of Germany. I don't really know what they call the president. I don't know what they call it in Germany. I think it's Prime Minister. She was kind of very instrumental in immigration policy within Europe, and because of her kind of viewpoint that immigration improves multiculturalism and is good for the country and Europe as a whole, because we're getting kind of like a mixture of views and things like that, that it was a good thing. But he kind of criticises that, because he says that there's the expectation there that people can come into Europe and become European, but if anybody from Europe was to go to Africa or to India or to China. You can't become African and Indian and Chinese from just living in the country, because you're a different culture. So you can't really expect that integration to happen just kind of like by itself. There needs to be something kind of, like in place to kind of help that happen. And Murray also talks about kind of like the humanitarian crises that are going on. Obviously, we should be allowing people that aren't safe and need somewhere to kind of go because their country is like war torn, and it's horrific the conditions that they have to live in. Of course we should grant them asylum. That's the whole purpose of asylum, that you grant that to them when they're seeking it. But Murray suggests that not all of the people that are coming via immigration are true asylum seekers. Like, a lot of them are economic migrants. They're moving for money purposes and not for safety purposes or whatever else encompasses an asylum seeker. And so for that reason, you've got people who are migrating all the way to North Europe. They're not even going to South Europe. They're going all the way up to places like Scandinavia. And so the question is, if it's safer in Europe, why are they going all the way up to the top of Europe? Why are they not staying, down the bottom of Europe, kind of thing? Obviously, I don't think those countries can really support them in the vast numbers. But then there must be something more attractive about the northern European places, because otherwise they wouldn't be coming all that way. Murray also talks about how if you were in another country and that country had a dominant faith, so for example, if you went to a Muslim country and you were to go and practice Christianity, that would be against their kind of laws. Like, it wouldn't be acceptable to go and kind of build a Christian church in a Muslim country, for example. But because Britain is tolerant and does allow other religions and other faiths, we've got lots of different kind of faiths in Britain. There's Hinduism and there's Judaism and all kinds of different ones. And we all kind of live together, and that's absolutely great. But then there is this kind of expectation that Britain should tolerate other faiths that are intolerant. So, for example, within a sect of Islam, not all of Islam is like this, but a sect of it, there's what's called Sharia law. And this kind of has some very odd things in it from a British cultural perspective. Obviously, it's not odd to them, it's their culture. That says things like, if you're a homosexual, that you are sinning, which, a lot of Christian faith says the same thing anyway. But within Britain, we would say that's quite an intolerant view. And things like, if a woman gets raped, then the rapist can marry her. And things like, you can, female genital mutilation is acceptable, even though the person wouldn't want it or didn't want it. Or did I say that wrong? Even if the person didn't want it or wouldn't want it. And then there is something as well that says that if anybody denounces the prophet, so kind of says bad things about the prophet, then they can be stoned to death. And so Murray then kind of cites examples of where European people who have the cultural value of free speech have joked or denounced the prophet in cartoon strips, for example, and then terrorists have gone and killed those people because that's their culture and that's their belief that they should avenge the prophet. And so Murray is kind of questioning whether Europe should be tolerant of that intolerance, because we would view that as intolerant. So if you're in Europe, then we really shouldn't be tolerating that, because our culture is to be tolerant. And so there's that kind of question there of, okay, if those sect of people have those viewpoints, that's okay if they're outside of Europe, but when they're in Europe, then that's different, because you're in Europe and Europe have cultural values of being tolerant. So it's kind of that kind of question of, should we be doing more about this? Obviously it's terrorism, or so that it's being deemed. It's not to suggest that everybody that believes in, but I mean, Sharia law, if you believe in Sharia law, then they're your viewpoints. So I don't really kind of know what else to say on that, really. There's also been some kind of analysis of statistics in terms of sexual violence against women, like gang rape of children, sex trafficking, genital female mutilation, as I mentioned before, In Germany, it's the highest in comparison to other places, and it equates with the immigration figures. And Murray kind of posits the question of, well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it, when you have immigrants that don't have the same values as Europeans, and they are okay with, certain aspects because of their culture. So, for example, attitudes towards women are very, very different in countries outside of Europe. And so they would have a different attitude and different behaviour towards women. And so Murray kind of is, talking about that as well. You can't really expect people to integrate when they migrate into a country and kind of are just with people that are of their culture. If they don't integrate with another culture, then there isn't that multiculturalism that was suggested to be a benefit. You've just got separate cultures, and they're very different, and they've got different views. And because Britain's tolerant, we're tolerating everything. But essentially, you're in Britain. Britain has cultural values. You kind of need to take those on, and if you don't agree with them, you shouldn't be in Britain and you shouldn't be in Europe. So I think that's kind of what Murray is kind of talking about. And if you were to say that kind of viewpoint without all that context, you'd be deemed xenophobic, because you'd be deemed to be against other people and immigration and whatever. But actually, if it was any other country, these would be kind of things that, if I went into another country, I'd be expected to integrate into their culture and to accept their cultural views. And even if I didn't agree with them, I'd be expected to behave in a certain way to kind of follow them. So, for example, if I was to go to Dubai, I wouldn't be able to do certain things as a woman. I'd have to make sure I was covered up. I'd have to make sure I didn't hold hands with a male and things like that, and kiss in public and all of those kind of things. I would have to behave in the way that their culture was, and that's absolutely fine if I'm moving to Dubai. But if someone from Dubai was moving to Britain, they'd have to accept how Britain was. And it's kind of that kind of question of, if you're coming into somebody else's country, not somebody else's, but you know what I mean, a different country, then you've got to kind of accept the values of that country, wherever you are in the world. It's just the respectful thing to do. But obviously, if you're not from a respectful, tolerant country, then you probably wouldn't have those attitudes anyway. So it's kind of that kind of debate. And I suppose as well, the problem is that it isn't actually just people coming into countries now and coming into Europe. It's people that have been here for a very long time. So because they haven't had that integration when they first came into the country, they've just continued to have the values that have come from other cultures. And therefore, and I'm talking as well about the intolerant parts of it, or what we deem in terms of Europe as intolerant parts of the cultures. Those are still there because, that's their culture. So it's really, really, really interesting book. I've probably not really done it justice. Very good to listen to, but like I said, it was very biased towards being against immigration. I'm sure there are many benefits of immigration. A lot of the people I know are not from Europe, because I live in a city, and I meet lots of people from outside of Europe, and people from other countries in Europe that have come to Britain and stuff, and it enriches your life to know other cultures and other values, and even outside of a country, every country within Europe has its different cultures as well. I think that's something to consider also. And so it does have its benefits, but there are problems, and just, trying to be nice and lovely to everybody means that you ignore all the problems that there are with it. And Murray also kind of finishes off by saying that immigration is also a problem, not in and of itself, but the fact of overpopulation. There's more people coming into Europe out of the countries that they've come from, and the countries that they're coming from are very big in comparison to Europe. Europe's very small in comparison. It's not like they're migrating to America or Australia that is a very big place, or like Asia or whatever. Everyone's coming to everyone's coming to like Europe. Europe's not very big. There's going to be lots of problems like school places, NHS pressures, and it is due to just there being too many people, an influx of people, and the infrastructure taking a while to kind of catch up. Things like housing crises and stuff like that. It's because we've grown so much in population, but the infrastructure can't grow at that speed, so you're going to have problems. So yeah, very, very interesting. Definitely worth a listen. I wouldn't say that I'd rave about it. It wasn't as good as his other one, but it was interesting to hear other views, and I think it's probably quite insightful for people that do have leftist views and think that immigration is great to see why other people are becoming quite nationalist in their views and are becoming quite, voting for Brexit and things like that. Like, those kind of right wing kind of views, they are backed up by some kind of thought. Like, a lot of people think, oh, it's just because people aren't very clever and they just vote the way that they do and stuff, but actually people really do think about things, and so Maria's kind of inciting that kind of that debate and that discussion that's probably needed.